He is an expert in water chemistry by vocation and avocation, and has developed the Bru'n Water tool, which many of us use to make sure that we have appropriate water going into our beers. Martin gave is this not based on the NHC presentation?
It has some elements.
Right, so he's presented this at the national level, so it's good information, and I think you'll find it quite useful and enjoyable. So,
thank you, Andy. Welcome, everyone. So tonight we're talking about Irish water and their stouts. So I welcome you all.
Would you mind? Could
Okay.
I move you over just a little bit?
Well,
I was trying to get the screen in.
I don't know that we really need to see me.
Okay, well.
But
you do have a hat though.
exactly. No, my souvenir from visiting Ireland. So just for those who take water to the nth degree, here's your certificate that, golden urethra of Ninkasi, and you're ready to go. It's a little few. So let's start with some Irish stout lore. So a lot of people say that, an Irish stout is brewed with a hard alkaline water because for a lot of Ireland, that is what they have. We'll show that that's not necessarily the case. The other bit of lore is that they say that Guinness sours their stouts because the Guinness draft definitely does have a sharp twang to it, and we'll get into that later. And then finally, people say, Guinness, it's a heavy beer. You chew it, you don't drink it. So we'll talk about all of these. Oops, let's go back. Okay, now let's get into the Irish stout facts. Guinness does in fact create what they call their Guinness flavor extract. They export it around the world, or did at least export it, to their breweries that are located around the world. That Guinness flavor extract happens to be a roast barley steeped in their low alkalinity water, and it produces a very distinctive flavor that is very difficult to duplicate in other places and with other waters. Yes, sir?
What are you saying, questions? Do you know if they use this in all of the Guinness product range, or is this just in Irish stouts or varying degrees?
Do not know, but more than likely this is used in all, because as we'll get into later in the presentation, you really need this component, and it needs to be a separate component in order to properly produce a beer. So that extract, because it is created with a low alkalinity water, i.e. somewhat almost Pilsen-like water, which RO is very similar to. And that creates the GFE. And then, I mentioned that heavy, high body characteristic of a good stout. There's always more than one way to create a heavy beer. We could boost the alcohol content and create a big beer that way that would certainly be chewy like a barley wine, but that is not what we're dealing with here. So the way that Guinness and other Irish breweries create that heaviness, that fullness, is through adding body with beta-glucans. So let's look at famous Irish stouts. Of course, there's Beamish and Murphy's. Both of those are from Cork, Ireland, which is in the southeast part of the country. And then there's Guinness, which is made in Dublin at St. James Gate Brewery. By the way, how many folks have been to Ireland? 1, 2, 3. Ah, well, for the rest of you, because there are quite a few here that haven't been, Ireland was a great trip. I enjoyed it immensely. You will have to rent a car, and I certainly recommend that you make it a very small car because the roads there are very small. Okay, and so 3 famous Irish stouts. Let's talk about the geology of Ireland and how that affects things. As you'll notice, I've highlighted Dublin and Cork, the progenitors of those 3 stouts that we just talked about. I also highlight Dundalk, which is where Harp Lager was created some 60, 70 years ago. So even though that's sort of outside this realm, it's still, as you can see here, based on the color tones, the bright reds are granite, which is an igneous rock, a non-carbonate rock. Then the sort of maroon and purples are sandstones. And again, they are not carbonate rocks. But in the middle of the island, you see all these turquoise and light blues. That's limestone. And that's the reason why the lore is hard alkaline water is what is used to brew there, which is almost true.
Martin, do you have any, I think I've seen something where like Ireland and the Appalachians are like the same body of land that just, way back. It doesn't really pertain.
They could be.
All right, moving on. Sorry.
So Central Ireland is indeed composed of limestone, and that will produce a hard alkaline water. The granite, though, is found along predominantly that whole eastern edge of the Irish Isle, and softer and less alkaline water comes off of those areas. So that's an important factor as to why many stouts are actually produced with what amounts to low alkalinity water. So the hydrogeology of Ireland is very similar to the geology. Like I said, the central Irish area is going to be hard alkaline water, both in the rivers and in the groundwater. And those surface waters from any of the sandstone or granite areas are going to be very low alkalinity, almost ion-free. So they'll pick up a little bit, but there's not a lot of calcium in granites and sandstones, and that's the reason why they aren't very hard. And let's go discuss hardness and alkalinity. They are quite different. Hardness is the presence of divalent metal ions like calcium, magnesium, iron, manganese, and for potable waters, that means that it would only mostly be calcium and magnesium, because if you have much iron or manganese, well, it tastes so metallic that it's really not a potable water, and it's certainly not suitable for brewing. The other component here, the alkalinity, is from the carbonate, so CO3, and in water at normal water pHs, around 7, that is present as in the form of bicarbonate. So calcium and magnesium, hardness, bicarbonate, alkalinity. So 2 different things. So let's talk about Dublin, the birthplace of Guinness and the home of the St. James Gate Brewery. The river and some local wells were probably the original sources of water there. But because Dublin grew, it was a good port town. And as you will see in just a moment, it was one of the thoroughfares for all the agricultural products from Central Ireland. So a lot of people moved to Dublin, and they were constantly in search of water, because Ireland, even though it seems like a very moist area, they really have some serious water supply problems. So every time I get on to one of their websites with for a water search, for those water providers, the water companies that deliver water, you will undoubtedly see, apologies for, we're if your water is out, they're working on it now. So there are a lot of problems. So because Dublin was a center of commerce back in the early days before the railroads, of course, England had an extensive canal system, which was actually duplicated somewhat in Ireland. The Grand Canal was created and ended up terminating in Dublin. We'll see in just a moment. But that Grand Canal and the water that was employed to keep the canal full of water, turns out that it came from a special place, and it made a difference. So let's look at a layout of the canal, and the canal continues on further west. Dublin here with Port City, you can see that the canal sort of skirts around the center of Dublin, or what was the center. Now Dublin extends well out here. And these Wicklow Mountains, and if you remember the geologic picture I provided, these are all granitic mountains, and that is a place where the forefathers of Dublin decided to set up reservoirs and aqueducts to supply both the canal and the city. Let's go backwards. Okay. Modern Dublin water supply. As I mentioned, they have a system of reservoirs, and that all started in the 1860s. And for those of you who recall Porter history, Porter started in the early 1700s, and it was I guess the talk of the town. It was the beer to have. If you had a London Porter, that was a great thing. And brewers from around the world were trying to duplicate it. Dublin was a case in point. St. James Gate and Guinness did their part to do the same. So I believe, I've got a slide in here, I think that Guinness started in 1759, if I remember correctly. So Guinness was in place before the reservoirs were created, but the Grand Canal was in place a little bit before that. So runoff from the Wicklow Mountains, those granitic mountains, are the primary source of water there. And we need to. I'm talking and we're not beer drinking, so that's a problem.
We're sitting here like idiots.
I am sorry for that.
Yeah, let's go.
Oh, by the way, before I forget, Rick brought some freebies here. There's some sachets of assorted dry yeast, some Mountaineer hops, and a lifetime supply of honey malt for a family of 4.
We're good with honey. What's it called when you do it?
And I've got 3 cans of the Guinness draft, so certainly keep passing.
Might be the worst with that. Tiny little, small. Sorry, I got the whole can. These are those mountains, yeah.
A good talk deserves good beer, so let's enjoy.
Cheers.
Slenta.
That's like a water hill.
Hey, is this the, maybe talk about this, it doesn't have to do with water, but if I recall correctly, Guinness signed a 1,000-year lease on the St. James Gate.
Something like that.
So that's an interesting arrangement, because I think in US, you can't really go beyond 100. I think it just gets too,
I don't know either.
perpetually, whereas they don't have those issues over there apparently, or didn't. But, so 20, whatever we put on our calendar, 2750?
Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I hope you're there. So that granitic geology from the Wicklow Mountains leaves that water that is flowing towards Dublin soft and non-alkaline. So here's I guess a figure showing what Dublin uses for their water. They have a number of water plants, and as you can see, even today, we have a number of reservoirs pulling water off the Wicklow Mountains. There are aqueducts and the Grand Canal that run towards, and the Grand Canal is still used as a thoroughfare to at least to deliver water to some degree. And of note, this line through here, that's the Liffey River. For those of you who have seen pictures of Dublin, and there's that fancy white bridge with, the fancy handrails and all that stuff, that's across the Liffey River. So,
Is that granitic as well?
no, so this is coming from the interior. So this is the delivery point of very hard and alkaline water. And as you might imagine, if it's not been raining much on the mountains, there isn't much water. And that happens apparently on good occasion. So then the Liffey River, or River Liffey, is very important for the water supply in Dublin. And as you might imagine, if they have to stop taking water from Wicklow and have to take it from Liffey, well, the water quality is going to change a lot. And there you go. So Liffey River picks up the alkaline groundwater in the lowlands. These other water plants have a little more quality in terms of brewing water, lower hardness and alkalinity. So that's the preferred. Now let's go back a little bit. Here we go. Please note the location of St. James Gate Brewery. So, River Liffey, going through here, and Grand Canal, which is picking up all this water from Wicklow Mountains, delivering it downstream. You can see that there's a decent possibility, even way back in the 1800s or even 1700s, that they would be subjected to really low alkalinity water. So it's fortuitous. Oops, wrong way. Okay, historic Dublin brewery. Guinness started in 1759. There were shallow wells on the property that supplied water to the brewery. And as I mentioned, that Grand Canal is, yeah, there we go, Grand Canal, 1780. I almost forgot about that. 3/4 of a mile, so not very far. And of course, a canal made out of soil is going to leak like a sieve, so voila, you've got potentially low alkalinity water in the vicinity of the Guinness Brewery. And that's been from almost day one. So the Guinness water source was probably not very alkaline. So that first myth, doesn't happen, never happened. When those Wicklow Mountain reservoirs were created, that Guinness water supply was certainly low alkalinity and had very little hardness. And as a matter of fact, I've seen pictures from people who have taken the Grand Guinness tour. They do have RO machinery in the brewery now because, as I pointed out, Dublin's water supply is not very stable. And if Guinness had to take water from the Liffey River and use that, it would not be the same product. It certainly would be a substantial change. So they fortified their supplies with RO water to create or maintain that low alkalinity and low mineralization. Okay, now let's move on to Cork, a little bit further south, southeast corner of the country. As I pointed out, they're sitting amongst sandstone formations, and the River Lee is flowing through that area. And so Cork, like Dublin, has relatively low alkalinity water and with little hardness too. So it's reasonable to assume that the water quality in Cork is very similar to Dublin, which is fortunate. And maybe that's the reason why Beamish and Murphy's exists there, because they could duplicate what Guinness was doing in Dublin. And just to reiterate, here's Cork way down here, Wicklow Mountains, this purple red, and the maroon is sandstone, and well, we won't bother with Dundalk. So, what people say Dublin water profile is, and actually this is somewhat accurate for water that comes out of the River Liffey. So 120 parts per million calcium, that's pretty darn hard. A little bit of magnesium, a little bit of sodium, no big deal. Chloride and sulfate, really not much to talk about, so that's a good thing. You don't necessarily, for these particular beers, we're not looking to flavor the beers with minerality. And then finally, the bicarbonate content, which contributes to the alkalinity, is pretty high. That's substantial. As a matter of fact, that water with 100 parts per million calcium and the 315 bicarbonate. Yes, sir.
What is the water in Indiana generally?
For most of the state, it's probably something like this.
Okay.
So, you bring up a good point.
So what were you gonna say? The calcium and bicarbonate make this water what?
Well, hard and alkaline, but
That's more bicarbonate than we have here, right?
It probably is.
But the RA is probably not too far, like, that's probably pretty close.
Yeah, potentially.
But typically, you would think this would work well for a dark beer.
And it does work well for most porters and
But
stouts,
Irish stouts are
but
different.
not an Irish dry stout. So we'll get into that. Okay, so don't do that if you're gonna brew an Irish dry stout. So this is the water profile that's likely to come from the Wicklow Mountains. And this was taken from some of the water quality results for, I think, yeah, Ballymore Eustace Water Report. So that's one of the water treatment plants for Dublin that gets all their water from the Wicklow Mountains. So very low calcium at 18 parts per million, bicarbonate down at 35. You know, these numbers are just a touch off of what amounts to Pilsen water.
Yeah.
So this is great brewing water. So how did they brew with this water? And certainly with respect to Wicklow water, there was no problem. You know, you low alkalinity, low hardness, but for those cases where you had a dose of Liffey water and you really needed to get the hardness and the alkalinity reduced, well, pre-boiling that water causes the solids to precipitate out. So all the calcium, or a lot of the calcium and a lot of the alkalinity drop out. So that's a good thing. So that's one way to brew with what amounts to that plaster water that the Liffey River delivers. Oops, my apology. And this is just a little side slide showing, you know, you can kind of figure out what's going on just by knowing calcium and bicarbonate concentrations and then the effectiveness of boiling. So that's just
And that's
proving.
That's just boiling, not adding anything to help precipitate.
Yeah, you don't necessarily need to, but you could add, one trick is to add a little bit of powdered chalk to the water while you're boiling it to help give it nucleation sites for the precipitates to form and drop out quicker. So, but that's just a sideline here. So, if you were to boil that, what amounts to River Liffey water, hey, look at that. We dropped that 120 down to 37 parts per million. That's not bad. You know, and we talked about Wicklow being roughly double that. I'm sorry, half of that concentration. So we're much closer. And at 60 parts per million bicarbonate, I think that's roughly double what the Wicklow water is also. And again, the chloride and sulfate are still reasonably low and not likely to cause much in the way of flavoring. And here's a quick comparison. So advice for brewing your stouts and porters. Although hardened alkaline waters do exist in Ireland, dry stout, this stuff, Guinness, Beamish, and Murphy's require a much lower alkalinity water. So from what I can tell, especially as evidenced by the production of the Guinness flavor extract, you know, so they are clearly doing that for a purpose, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the recommendation is to separate your pale malt mashing and the roast malt. Mash them separately or steep them separately, so that you don't drive the pH of the overall mash too low. There's a couple of reasons why you want to avoid that. So the higher alkalinity water is appropriate for most stouts and porters. That gives them a nice full flavor. Let's talk about this beer right now. So Guinness Draft. This is almost a year old. Let's see, Guinness is 4.2%. Murphy's, which we will also taste, is 4%. We can probably serve a couple of cans of those too. They are similar, but substantially different too. But this one elicits notes of coffee and a bit of acidity, which recall the stout lore was that Guinness supposedly sours their beers, and I don't believe that that's necessarily what they're doing. What's happening is that they're starting with this Wicklow mountain water, which is very low alkalinity, steeping that water, probably hot steeping, and I don't know that for sure, but it's very likely because the extraction improves as you increase the temperature. The only question that I have in my mind is whether or not they actually do an acid rest and allow lactobacillus to proliferate in the beer, in the GFE product before it's added to the rest of the beer, rest of the wort.
Or if the acidity just comes from the roasted grains. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
So roast barley with a distilled water mash will produce a pH in the mid to mid-high 4 range, which for the brewers in the room, that's substantially lower than what we typically like to see. We want to see things in the 5.2 to 5.6 range, and that 4.7 would not be a good one.
So Martin, I assume we're still doing the typical 1.3 quarts per pound mash water ratio. So when you go to sparge, how do you just dump your dark grains on top and sparge out, or how do you sparge your dark grains? What do you do?
That is a good question, and I don't know what Guinness does. I don't know if they add the flavor extract, if they add it as a sparging aid or with the sparging flow, or if they just add that wort together with the pale wort in the kettle.
My guess, if they're sending it around the world, or they were or are sending it around the world, you wouldn't want to not get all the yield out of it by adding it to the mash. You'd probably go directly into the kettle.
Probably. So opinions on the Murphy's Stout? I'm getting a little bit more roundness, maybe a hint more chocolate.
What are you saying the GFE is? Is it a fermented product or
No.
It's an unfermented wort?
It's wort.
There's probably not a lot of fermentables in it if it's just like roasted barley or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's only the pH that keeps it stable when it's being shipped around.
Yeah.
They don't add any preservatives.
Because acidity is a preservative.
So have you done this? You've made this extract
Mm-hmm.
and you use it in an Irish stout? Okay. Interesting.
So did you
And Tom,
I've done it. I think I've just added
you mash capped.
I think I like mash captive, like
Yeah.
do the majority of you do a
Pale
pale
ones,
mash,
yeah.
and then just,
Top it off with the darks.
That's what I've done, and that's what I have here on the recipe, is that I did the straight up mash and then layered on the dark grains on top of that, and it came very, very close. So that's why I was asking if you capped it, or if you sparged it
I think,
separately, or what.
I think I actually did do, like, right when you came up with this stuff, Martin, I mean, I was digging in the water. I think I did a refrigerator, like, extraction. You know, I did like a liter of water in the fridge, and
So it's not
I think I added that to the boil.
It's not like a mash of roasted barley.
Well,
It's just a
no.
cold extraction essentially.
I don't, well, it certainly wouldn't be a cold extraction. It's gonna be at least at roughly 100 degrees. If, you know, normal steeping for accessory grains is in the, you know, 150 range or something like that. And of course, with no boundaries due to, you know, enzymes and things like that.
If all you want's the acids and the color, I mean, yeah, 100 would be fine. Yeah.
Yep.
And knowing me, I'm always like conversion paranoid. So like even when I sparge, I'll generally collect my wort in the kettle at some temperature that still allows some conversion in case there's a stray starch that gets in there. So I probably put it in, you know, at 160 something, just to be able to convert anything that was any starches.
Yeah. Extend your mash too.
Right, mash in the pail.
I mean, doing a whole separate mash is
Yeah.
So does anybody pick up just a hint of acetaldehyde in the Guinness?
In the Murphy's, I guess.
I was getting
think
that
it's,
in the Guinness, yeah.
yeah,
That
just a
acid was leaning
teeny
a
bit
little
of.
green. I thought it was maybe my IPA.
So anyhow, back to stout and porter brewing.
But this one-
For the typical stouts and porters, having your having a water with higher alkalinity that counteract the acidity of the roast grains is very beneficial to helping take the edge off those roasted products. So having that mashing pH in the 5.5 to 5.7, maybe even 5.8 range does make a much rounder, more balanced, less acrid roast flavor to your beers. So that's a good thing there. But that's not what we want for the Irish Dry Stout. So, and just as a side note, you know, the bicarbonate, recall that the,
Was it 300?
yeah, it was 300 ppm bicarbonate in that, I guess it's the Liffey River water. So more than likely you would still need some acidity in order to knock that stuff down. So that's tough water. So they might very well have, even if they wanted to produce a true porter, which is not an Irish dry stout, they probably would have still wanted to take the bicarbonate content down a little bit. So, as I mentioned, 5.5 to 5.6 certainly makes the roast flavor a little more gentle and approachable, smoother. Concentrations of magnesium, sodium, chloride, and sulfate, they're just really bit players, and we're not really trying to accentuate that like in a Burton ale or something like that, where you know, sulfate is the king. So, guide for historic water profiles. first of all, don't believe all the historic water profiles that you see in a variety of books and on the internet, because sometimes they're not very well researched, and in a lot of cases they tend to not be balanced, meaning that the anions and the cations don't really balance out, and that water wouldn't actually exist in the wild. Those flavor ions, the magnesium, sodium, sulfate, and chloride, in general, we're going to try and keep those low, at least for when it comes to porters and stouts, including Irish Dry Stout. As far as I'm concerned, calcium and bicarbonate levels are never a target. I generally like to see at least 40 parts per million calcium in any beers that I brew, because that is good in the mash, because then oxalates from the grains are actually precipitated out in the mash tun instead of in your kidneys via kidney stones. So, good stuff.
Or on your brewing equipment.
Oh, that's true. And in your kegs, and sure. Okay, so let's talk about a typical Guinness dry, or a Irish dry stout recipe. This is my interpretation of what a lot of recipes tend to point to. 75% pale malt, and that's just a regular pale 2-row. 1.3 or at 15% flaked barley, and it could be flaked barley, raw barley, or chit barley. Any of those three.
Chit barley, not chit malt.
Yeah, I'm sorry, chit malt. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Chit malt is like mostly.
It's mostly raw.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
it's
rawish.
just, yeah, it's rawish. And
Not raw, not raw.
and the thing about raw barley and flake barley and any other barley products, until they're malted, those relatively raw products have a lot of graininess, and I mean a lot. So I tried to brew with flake barley in pale beers, just as a heading agent. Use those so the flake barley and the raw barley provide the beta glucans that are what really build body and head in this particular beer and in any beer.
So just to double click on that, I think I've only ever used flake barley in a Irish stout, but I'm generally opposed to anything flaked, just because they seem to get oxidized, rancid very quickly, and
Could
so
be.
I'd be more inclined to use just raw barley if I could. But what's the gelatinization temperature of raw barley? Anybody? I'm sure I've known this and I've just forgotten.
I have no idea.
All right.
And can we even get raw barley?
Probably. I mean, you can get anything.
There's farms around here.
In America, there's no tariffs. It's all good.
But so I through the brewing of those pale beers with these relatively raw barley components, I definitely found out that that graininess is something that's not pleasant. It's overwhelming and not appropriate in most beers.
So you find your raw barley, Jake says, on that website, 142 to 140,
Nine. This is
Gelatinization.
saying 126 to 138, so.
pretty low.
It's the same, basically, same as barley.
Yeah,
Right.
Okay.
Just malted.
just raw. Got it.
Good. So, and Tom, you're probably right that the flake products might oxidize more quickly. So, But anyhow, as an alternative,
Like flaked oats, well, I mean, there's a ton of oil in flaked oats, and those will go rancid
Rancid.
super fast.
yeah, inflate oats.
And crystal malts I find go fast too. I don't know why they're faster, but they seem to be.
So as an alternative in pale beers that don't have the roast to cover up the graininess of the barley, I tend to use wheat products, so flaked wheat and raw wheat and even raw malt. I'm sorry, wheat malt. That tends to produce, well, it doesn't have as much beta-glucan as barley does, but its real asset is that its flavor is much less grainy. So it's a whole lot more pleasant and palatable in those pale beers that, you know, have no place to hide that graininess from barley. Finally, the final component is 10% roast barley, and I'm a big fan of crisp roast barley because I find that they have a truly wonderful coffee note. It's one of the best in the world, and I'm glad that we can get it here. So.
How long, what temperature?
So that's steep. You know, it's you could go as long as you want.
Like 30 minutes is probably good.
You know, in the typical steeping scenario, yeah, 30 to an hour.
Yeah.
And-
100 degrees.
And I would personally, I would take it to, you know, 130, 40. I'm not, as I mentioned, I don't know that we need to perform any sort of an acid rest to create more of the lactate ion content in our
It sounds like a great experiment though, like do a batch 2 days beforehand or 24 hours in advance, keep it at 110 degrees,
That would
Well,
be.
get
Well-
some lactic, a little bit of lactic going maybe.
well, I think that what you would do is toss a little raw pale
Yeah,
malt in
something
there
that
because
roasted is,
the roast is probably devoid or
Yeah.
almost devoid of any lactobacillus,
Yeah, I would.
bacillus, so that would at least give that an opportunity to do. But you know, I don't know what Guinness does or any of the other breweries do, so that would be a nice investigation. Quick enough to find out if we had a full brewery tour, but I'm not sure that they do that. In the case of a Guinness clone, EKG, a decent little charge early on, and then a flavor addition at 15 minutes. In Irish Ale Yeast, and as you can see, 1042, and this is roughly a, you know, that should produce roughly a 4% brew. SRM is nice and reasonably high, 31, so it will be a black beer. Oops. Let's see. Okay, so let's now talk about why we have to separate this stuff out. So in this particular case, I've shown the results of the Bru'n Water pH prediction, and I've got just really minor additions of gypsum and calcium chloride, mainly to bring that calcium so I'm starting with RO water in this particular case, and I just brought the calcium content to at least 40 parts per million. My sulfate and chloride are still very modest at under 50. And in order to bring the pH of, now this is just the pale malt and the flake barley or the raw barley, whatever, it shouldn't make any difference. You can see that I had to add just a little bit of lactic acid in order to take the edge off of this, just to bring, because so pale grains like pale malts and a raw barley, you're going to end up with a pH around 5.7, 5.6, which is really too high. And you can end up introducing too many tannins to the beer. So to get it down to a proper pH that improves the enzyme activity, that little bit of lactic acid was necessary. So that's just the pale components there. And I also did a little analysis, if I had done it with all the grains together. So now it's the pale malt, flake barley, and that 10% roast barley, and I took the lactic out because, as you can see from the pH, 5 point. So, and I kept the gypsum calcium chloride the same, so that I guess the flavor of the water would not change. As you can see, we're getting pretty darn low.
Against what it is, what does it say?
5.15. And that's the main reason why we have to keep this down. Now, the reason why pH is important here is because the enzyme activity and the proteolysis go way up, and you end up cleaving all the bodybuilders to bits. So making sure that you're not destroying those bodybuilders, that's important. So that's why we're doing this separate, and that's the reason why Guinness has long done it separately too.
So the pH will break them up. Beta-glucans, is that what you're saying?
It chops everything up. So it chops all those proteins.
Yeah.
We're looking for like.
You want to be out of the protein kind of rest area, basically.
So we're looking for mid-length proteins, and we added all those beta-glucans in there, which a beta-glucan is a polysaccharide, so it's like dextrin and all those guys. So they are long chain sugars, but they are not really fermentable. So as long as we don't destroy them in the mash, we will have them throughout. Yes, sir.
So, if you're too high in pH, you would add an acid. Some people might think if you're too low in pH, you might add a base to try to go up.
You could.
But this doesn't work because the typical bases you would add aren't very soluble, right?
Well, no. So this is the overall pH, and that overall pH for these combined streams, the GFE and the pale worts, having a starting pH in the kettle, in the kettle or in the fermenter, that's a good thing, and that's what we want, because as we're tasting with these Irish dry stouts right now, they have a bit of an acidic tang to them. And so we can't drive the overall pH up because it's not going to be an Irish dry stout anymore.
Yeah, because you want it acidic at the end.
We need it to be acidic. So Guinness came up with a way to protect the main mash and protect all the bodybuilders, and brought it together in the kettle, and voila, here we go with very nice beers.
So this doesn't work because to get the pH down low enough to get the acidity, you destroy the body fillers.
Yes. So now the one thing that, you know, okay. So I mentioned this, quarter milliliter per gallon addition for the main mash. You know, the other option here is maybe a little bit of that roast barley, just enough to bring the pH down to, you know.
Pre-made the extract, maybe a little bit of the extract.
Or, yeah. So you could use that as your pH adjustment tool. The problem is that might be a little bit more of a pain in the ass, so. And plus, I don't know where the buffering for that flavor extract might be, so. Yeah.
So GFE is not equal to sour goose.
No, because sour goot we know is actually,
Yeah,
you know,
I'm just kidding.
yeah.
If I were to measure the total acidity of the GFE, could I then figure out how much to add?
Yes, indeed.
So like titrate it, figure out the,
Yeah, I got a new
Or-
fancy tool that does that.
Or just give it,
Yeah,
or
great.
or the Tom way, where you give it a dollar and then
And then test it.
test it.
Yeah.
Jake,
And
us
like
mere
a-
mortals do
or-
not have
That's
that
what I was
tool.
thinking. Yeah.
I need to
It's just a
double,
pH
double
electrode,
set double
but-
it now.
Yep.
I like it.
Mhm. Okay, so all grains together. So the end result. Well, that's the end result. 5.15, which is not bad, and at least it helps explain why dry stout it tastes the way it does, and it's not necessarily because the beer or wort were soured. It's because we've added components that have driven the pH down in the kettle or fermenter, and that echoes into the beer. So, any questions?
So that won't give the yeast any problems going that low in pH
No.
on.
So, of
they
course,
love it.
yeah, exactly.
Wine yeast go at 3 like it's nothing. It's fine.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And
Well,
it's
most-
the same strain of yeast usually.
Most ale yeasts deal down in the low 4s.
Yeah.
Lagers end up being, I want to say, the mid 4s.
Yeah, 4.3,
Okay.
4.5.
So,
So no problem there.
so driving the pH lower is actually a form of infection control.
Yeah.
The quicker that you can get the overall, because the wort's coming out at 5.15 or thereabouts, it'd probably be 5.2 or 5.3 for a regular beer. But we need to get it down to, I want to say 4.7 as quickly as possible to help prevent the attack or influence of spoilers that obviously change the flavor of the beer.
If you test the pH of your finished fermented beer and it's above 4.6, then you've got a stability risk. You got an infection risk, and that beer won't last.
Yep.
If it gets exposed to any bacteria.
Water Resources Engineer. WRE.
Diplomat of
What
water.
does that mean?
Diplomat of Water Resources Engineering. Yes.
Does that come with a sword?
Oh, sure.
How about a round of applause for our water?
Thank you. So there's more beer.
No
You're in next door.
Beamish.
No, I'm not sure that Beamish is actually available any longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I did have Beamish while we were there, and it's not Murphy's. I don't find it very pleasant.
But it is closer to Murphy's, in my opinion, than Guinness.
So you're kind of squeamish about me.
And there's very made kind of squeamish about what? Genus. So it is very hard to get these beers side by side. I think Martin and I have both done it in Kinsale or somewhere. There's a couple of places. There's very few places where you can get them all. But I've gotten all three side by side. And I didn't get too much of a weird look. They're like, oh, I see what you're doing. But Guinness is everywhere. It's a little harder. Like you really see Murphy's and Beamish in the South.
Yes. So.
And there's rumor, like you ask people from Cork, and they're like, is these things still brewed here? And they're like, yeah, I think so. Like it's like because there's Heineken on the Murphy's can. There was, I think, one of them's at least somewhat brewed in the Netherlands.
That would be Beamish, yeah.
Or Murphy's if it has it on the can.
Murphy's is owned by Heineken. It says
Is it
all over the can.
I thought Beamish was Heineken.
It says it all over the can.
Maybe they both are.
Okay.
Might both be.
Oh, yeah, maybe they are.
Yeah.
So, that's what happened with Caffrey's, right? When Boddington's and Caffrey's were owned by the same entity, you couldn't get Caffrey's in the US anymore. It doesn't come here anymore.
Well, I included a brief mention of Dundalk and the fact that the water there is likely to be very Pilsen-like, and I guess it's not a surprise that Harp Lager, started out there. So that was, I think they call it Great Western Brewing, is the brewery or former brewery in Dundalk. Apparently, it's now a distillery. I forget who bought it, but.
The Murphy's Brewery in Cork was pretty cool.
So you've been there?
Well, no, I just pulled up a picture.
Oh.
They called it Heineken Ireland.
On the internet, you can go anywhere.
So the thing you were saying about the carbonate and how it turns into bicarbonate at the different pHs.
I'll let the cat out.
Yep.
That is very similar to sulfites, actually. And I've been trying to, this new analyzer I bought analyzes sulfites as well, and so it's interesting and trying to get my head around it.
Yeah, well, and you've seen the triple for carbonate ion in its subspecies
Yeah.
are all pH
pH
dependent.
dependent, yeah.
Yeah.
Temperature dependent sometimes. It's interesting.
In your presentation, you mentioned temporary hardness in the water you could remove through boiling.
Yep.
But I have seen permanent hardness or TDSs that give it up, you're not going to get rid of them. You have to.
Yep.
So how does the total dissolved solids with permanent hardness affect this versus the water you can change?
Well,
I mean, this is, and I'd say, Carl, these questions are interesting and from a historical perspective because from an energy cost standpoint, nobody really boils their water anymore. They RO blend it.
yes.
Or,
Well, I go straight RO anymore or distilled water because it's too messy for me to try and figure all that out, and it's just easier. But I know we have, and I still run it through an exchange and softener and all that kind of stuff, and I still have TDS out the yin yang.
Yes,
something's
exactly.
wrong.
So a softener doesn't really change the total dissolved solids. It just
Substitute.
yeah.
But-
It's a
but that should come out in RO, so there must be, I think
Yeah.
there's something wrong with your RO.
Well, I don't do RO. It's a
Oh.
water softener, it's a potassium chloride exchange.
You don't want-
Oh, you don't want to. Yeah, that's not a good
Yeah,
brewing
and
water.
so there's close to nothing in the water
No, there's a
except
lot
for
in the water.
Oh,
TDSs.
there's an enormous amount in water.
Soft water
I
is
got the
not,
report back, and there's
Soft water
not
is,
a lot.
No, there's a lot.
Yes.
it doesn't take it out, it just exchanges.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna bring in the report if I can find it and have you guys talk about it, because, I ran it through there because I just wanted to see what it was. But I noticed the TDSs were 300 something still, and
Yeah, when I go through my softener, it changes less than 10% on a TDS meter. Like it'll go from 370 to
Yeah.
400. It'll usually go up if I remember correctly.
Well, maybe. So my water is around 600 ppm TDS.
Oh, gee.
And it's still 600 after it's been
That's south of
completed.
the city of Carmel.
So that, they call it
Right,
soft
too.
water because it doesn't
I guess
leave
that's just, I
the
don't know.
water
if that's
Martin, is that
on
breakfast
your-
cereal?
Or is
It's
So-
45.
the sodium and the phosphate actually softer on the piping and stuff?
Yeah, it's softer because and salt dissolves
Well,
a lot easier
because
than
it's-
calcium.
Calcium and magnesium scale
So they
in
precipitate
hard
out
deposits.
much easier. Okay.
Yeah,
on
so-
on my shower walls, I still have deposits, but I can wash them and they come right off
Yeah.
because they're in
It's
essence
salted.
But Carl, to
There's
your,
salt-
to your
yeah,
point
salt.
is, you're not, your water and
Or-
your
or
TDS
baking
are just
soda.
as high, if not higher, after going through a softener.
Well, I want to see if I can,
Yeah,
I
it's
have
just
it on
been
my phone.
replaced with
It's
chloride
just-
and potassium.
Yeah, but still, that's
no
nice.
no chloride doesn't change.
No, I gotta
So-
find- I don't think it's on my phone, but if I find, I'm gonna
Oh,
bring it
it's
in, you
just-
guys can
It's just, cation.
Cations are
tell me, what's going on with it. I just know that the water is just brutal and you had to do something about it, but it's not on my phone.
It's brutal.
Look at that head. Beautiful. Creamy. Of course, both of these samples are nitrogen widgeted, so
But you did get back to, does TDS affect what you have, or is it relevant to the conversation?
Depends on what the solids are.
So no.
If they're calcium, it matters. If
The-
they're
the-
sodium,
I-
it changes the
the-
flavor, but it doesn't matter in the reaction sense as much.
The only thing I use a TDS sensor for is to verify my ROs.
R is working, yeah.
exactly.
That's the only,
TDS
that's the only
doesn't
thing
tell you a
it tells you. And like my RO, I've got I don't know, it's over 15-year-old membrane now, and it comes out at 4.
Yeah.
It is, wow,
And
it's
you
crazy.
feed it.
I feed it non-softened water,
Really?
yes, because I don't wanna waste all that water, like I don't
Yeah,
wanna
there's
waste
no
the water of
reason to waste the
softening
salt.
and then waste and so it's like and it's a pretty efficient RO, it just doesn't get a ton of use, and there's no pressure on the end, so there's minimal pressure on the end, because I use one of those condensate powered pumps that makes it look like it's no pressure on the out end.
Okay. They're noisy though.
They do click, but my living space is far enough away where it's not a problem. I remember you had one and you got rid of it because
Well, no,
family complaints or.
it broke.
Oh.
So it uses the residual pressure.
Of the out water, of the outcast water.
Yeah, and it click, 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 click. Very annoying thing, so, yeah. But, glad everybody could make it.
Thank you.
Are there still beers left?
Works well, works well.
Well, we still have beers left, if you're in, dry.
If I'm using our water.
Oh, I have a question for you about chloride sulfate ratio.
Sure.
So you said that basically in this profile that doesn't matter.
Sort of like under emitting.
Is that because it's just so low overall that the ratio of those doesn't really
Largely,
matter?
and the ratio doesn't matter really at all. There is no such thing as ratio.
Really?
It's magnitude. Magnitude of chloride, magnitude of sulfate. Because I can have a 4-to-1 ratio with, 4 parts sulfate to 1 part chloride, or I could have 400 parts sulfate to 100 parts chloride. I assure you they are completely different waters. But the ratio is the same.
Yeah.
The whole sulfate chloride ratio is one of the dumbest things that was ever invented. Yes.
Okay.
What happened there? Why is the chloride sulfate ratio dumb?
Because it is all dependent upon, so you can, if
You
you're
can't
basing.
have you can't have 300 of both and call it an even ratio and still be the same.
Yeah. Or,
So like the total amount is matched.
yeah, it's the total content, not necessarily the ratio.
But so if you had, like that example where you had 300 ppm of chloride and 300 ppm of sulfate, what would that do to the beer? Would that make for a muted IPA or
It
like?
would be extremely minerally.
Well, yeah,
You
yeah.
taste it at that point.
You would definitely taste it.
Tastes weird.
But
And
what-
I have produced, I did a true Dortmund profile that I researched. And by the way, Dortmund doesn't get water from their historic locations anymore. They built I think 100-mile pipeline or something like that that brings them good water, because Dortmund water really does suck. And to brew with it was quite a feat. So those Dortmund exports, with the level of minerality that potentially the original water might have contributed, I mean, you knew you were drinking a very minerally product. And I want to say that Dortmund is, I think, 130 or 170 parts per, I can't remember the number, but chloride. And I ultimately came to the conclusion that, yeah, you really don't want your chloride to get much above like 70 or 80 parts per million. And the same thing goes for sulfates. You know, they can certainly go much higher, but when you get sulfate and chloride high, all you get is mineral.
You can definitely taste sulfate when it gets to 300, 350. Some people like it though. Like a lot of people like
Yeah.
the flavor. But you can taste it for sure.
I miss chemistry classes. This was fun.
Nerd!
The chemist sucked.
Yeah, professional chemist. Okay, thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's not a normal time.